Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Smallville Season 1, Episodes 5 and 6. So, as you can start to see the Smallville formula emerge here, because in a number of superhero shows, they either usually have one villain throughout a whole season, so that way they can, avoid having to go on and make up multiple villains, or have to go on and pay XYZ amount of money to go on and bring certain big names in for a show. Because, of course, every character from off of a comic book is to have to pay some copyright to whoever that person is. So, say, for example, Clark Kent has a copyright that you have to pay the original family who came up with that character, and so basically that's why they have a certain set number of cast, and then eventually they go on and say, okay, well, we're gonna go on and here's how we're gonna save money by just coming up with a original villain for every episode until we then go on and have more money for the show, and then we'll start bringing guys in like Brainiac or Metallo, or eventually a much more comic book known character that Clark can play with via these either episodes or whole season. So, with that said, really, with a show like this, honestly, going on and doing the villain is basically just quickly coming up with a concept of it. And so, for those characters who are to go on and complain about how, man, I didn't feel that my character's story was all that good, and, yeah, really we have to go on and realize that to really just go and have a villain that's just based off of a concept, really isn't to, have me go on and just be really jazzed about anyone else's writing and how they're going to go about doing their characters. But, also, I gotta say, it's tough to have to, have everybody be used consistently, because, of course, people are to be contracted to do a number of episodes, so it's just really tough finding how to fit everyone in, especially if they're already contracted to do 12 episodes within 23 or 24, and it's just well, okay, I guess considering he's going to be used half through the season, we have to go on and figure out how we can keep having Lionel or keep having Lex consistently in the show, and so on and so forth. And we have to just keep writing stuff for them to do, because we've already contracted a number of episodes for them to do. So anyways, going on into these episodes, I gotta say, I like episode 5, but then we get to episode 6, and I'm just man, did they really stretch this one? Honestly, in episode 6, Clark, it just seems like he's needing to take down, the common murderer, and I'm just man, this guy doesn't really have any powers. You know what? Superman goes on and is to fight, whole entire groups of villains, and they have to be really unique to really give Superman a run for his money. And in this show, we go on and we have to have Clark, who's just fighting the common crook. And I'm just huh? I want to see Clark fight like his match, like in every episode. I want to go on and have Clark, who's to really have a legitimate like uh villain that should easily take up a whole episode, not just having me going and be like, man, they're really stretching this one. Because I feel that episode 6 was a stretch. That felt like they were just kind of doing some filler, honestly. Um, and I get like the concept of episode 6 where it's like they wanted to go on and try to use some like unusual elements for a story. I get that. It's just the eventual villain out of this episode just felt so weak. Uh, but episode 5 seemed to be fun. The things that they go on and do in episode 5 seem to be fun. Uh, how we're going on and consistently having like the Clark and Lana will they won't they kind of thing, even though Whitney is just like, well, hey, like, who am I, chop liver? She's my girl up until certain XYZ season where I go on and I leave for the military. Yeah, eventually that might happen for Whitney, and so yeah, and I think that's how they bring back a certain character from a villain from episodes of which that we've already talked about. I think it's been a while since I've seen the show, but I'm making a guess there, but I'm not quite sure it's accurate. So we'll figure that out when we get there. Because at some point they have to go on and bring back villains, especially once it seems that some aren't all defeated all that easily. So, anyways, uh, in episode 5. So, episode 5, we are to go on and have me assuming that Smallville is going into a winter kind of territory. I can't really know or understand when exactly it is to be hot and when it's to be cold within Smallville because everybody tends to wear sweaters or jackets anyways. So I can't tell when it's warm and when it's cold in Smallville because everybody wears the same clothes all the time anyways. Look at Clark, he wears the same sweaters every single episodes to just have continuity. But we also find out that Clark is really good at math. And good for him because I'm freaking horrible at it. So, anyways, let's go on and so Sean, of course, is to be a villain in episode 5. We end up seeing, of course, Sean, who is to accidentally fall into this ice cracked water. And so I'm like, okay, so this is winter time, but like we have it being so cold in Smallville that the ice freezes over, but it doesn't snow evidently. Unless I'm going to see eventually in other episodes that it snows in Smallville, Kansas. I don't know. We'll have to figure that out. How eventually we go on and we go into now the 5th episode. Whereas in the pilot, like, the ice wasn't frozen, but now, after a number of supposed days, now all of a sudden now, the ice is now, like, frozen pretty well. I'm just trying to think of these episodes and try to understand them. Because, yeah, a number of days ago, because this is supposed to be days of time, because 1 week of an episode is to have been like the next day. So how is it water is frozen in 1 number of days, But then I don't know. I don't know whether. My bad. So, anyways, we have Sean, who is to concoct the power of not having his body feel warm, and so he starts to become blue and frozen. And so Sean desperately goes on and is to try to find any other thing to keep his body warm besides people. But then all of a sudden, Sean is to realize that when he goes on and touches someone, he is to become warmer for longer compared to all the other stuff that he tries. So the real episode honestly should have called like Body Heat or something like that, but I think people would have written that off as a joke. But anyways, besides it being called like Cool or Cold or whatever it ends up being called in this episode. But so we then go on to episode 6, and both Pete and Clark are to go on and to do some community service to read to the elderly at this old folks' home. And so we have Clark, who is to go on and meet a woman named Cassandra, who, of course, is to be some kind of fortune teller, of course, because she somehow was to be written in as this person who had been somehow changed through the meteorites landing onto Smallville. So Cassandra is to be this fortune teller, and it seems that she goes on and touches people and is to know their fortune. We also go on and have a guy named Harry who is to stumble. He's to stumble upon his villainous power, and really all that he does go on and legitimately do is become forever young, as if he's Mel Gibson. And so, or as if he's God, if it's as if he's Vulture from the 90s Spider-Man cartoons, where Vulture was to go on and like touch people and like suck the youth out of them. Like that's almost as close as what Harry does in here, but like he doesn't actually touch people, like suck the youth out of them. Or he ends up being like God from the parody superhero movie where the guy is close to death, and so he like touches people and sucks the health out of them so he can eventually live for another hour. And I don't really get that idea either. That's a goofy idea. So we have Harry that is to go on, and because he is much younger, he decides to then go after all of the jurors that were to have sent him to jail. Even though Harry is no longer in jail, he spent his time and got out to eventually go on to be in an old folks home. But this guy is just still bitter about that whole thing. And so, AKA, hey, we need a villain to do something in this episode. We just need a villain that's to be old, but like has to become young to avenge some grudge. Because like this guy is probably dying anyways, so why should he care? But like this guy just wants to just continue killing because he just likes it. Now that he's young, he's like, man, I just want to go on and start killing. I have a second chance at life, and I'm going to go and blow it by killing people. That sounds great, right? Holes are happening. Plot holes. Holes are just... you can't fill them. Anyways, second chance at life, and you just want to just go to jail for longer. Anyways, that is what it is. So yeah, so let's go on and double fire this bad boy up. Let's hurry up and go on into spoilers. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that having you spoil this movie. I apologize, or this show, these episodes. I apologize if these reviews are very long. I like to have just talk about these episodes and just kind of talk about either how goofy they are or eventually just kind of talk about them. It's fun for me. So hopefully I'm going to try to make these as short as humanly possible. But I like to just have fun with goofy concepts and kind of tell people certain certain knowledge about just superhero shows because it's fun. So for me, anyways, let's go into episode 5. So we have Clark, we have Chloe, who arrive at Crater Lake Park for whatever goofy reason. And so again, this is during winter, supposedly, and people are going on and cuddling next to one another, being outside by a bonfire, which, yeah, I guess that does make sense because there's a lot of people year round who have outdoor parties near a bonfire, and even when it's during winter time, and I don't really understand that, but stuff like that exists. So we go on and we also have some really good continuity because Whitney is to go on and be throwing this football around and he doesn't have his letter jacket on, and I'm like, oh my god, that is to be awesome because when you think about it, Tina had Whitney's letter jacket last, and so Whitney should probably not have his letter jacket in this episode because I don't think Whitney was to go on and easily get this letter jacket back. So it makes sense. So we have Clark, we have Chloe going to this this get together, and so of course Clark is to go on and see Lana yet again, and so we really start to have Clark's friends who are just starting to get irritated that like Clark is hogging up all of the possible love possibilities, and everyone else is to get like shafted or to not have them do well in the whole them finding someone kind of area. So we go on and have all of a sudden Sean, who is deciding to finally go on and talk to Chloe because I guess he's probably talked to every other girl in Crater Lake and no one seems to be interested. So Sean goes on and is to tell Chloe that he's always been kind of interested in her, and hey, how about we go on and exchange phone numbers and maybe we'll go out sometime. And so Chloe's like, sure, yeah. And of course, Chloe ends up giving Sean like this 555 number. And for those of you that don't go on and know, there is never actually a phone number that starts with 555. Because that is a part of a movie or a show that they purposely put in there for a phone number because it doesn't exist out there. You can thank Tommy Two-Tone for doing 8675309 and that whole song and putting out a seemingly legit phone number that everybody eventually goes on and calls. And so yeah, like you get that whole deal where now doing 5555, there is no number of that exists. Usually it's like 555 1 2 3 4 or whatever, some goofy crap like that. So anyways, pushing on. So Sean is playing football with the guys, and all of a sudden we have Sean realize that the football has gone too far into this frozen lake that I would like to hope is very thin of ice because this just froze just today. So all of a sudden Sean is to walk through Crater Lake to get to this football, and he's kind of slipping and sliding a little bit. And so all of a sudden, while Sean gets his football, he starts to walk back to the guys, and all of a sudden, by the time Sean almost gets to getting out of this lake, all of a sudden the lake starts to crack. Sean falls in, and we of course have meteorites that are within this lake. And so while Sean is to go on and drown and die and never get superhero powers or supervillain powers in this case, the credits roll and the episode ends. Because he should be dead. How does he have powers? He should be dead. But no. Sean instead is to punch his way through this ice as if he's Super Shredder, and eventually is to go on and now become this character with powers that is to need body warmth to be able to survive. So we push on, and we now have to give you story for this episode. Somebody save me! We have a theme that is to go on and play every episode now because it's freaking awesome. And eventually, at some points, I listen to the theme, and I like to listen to the theme fairly, I like to listen to the Smallville theme song at a very fast speed because it sounds really cool when you have the Smallville theme done really quickly. Because I like to go on and listen to certain music at a faster pace, and it actually sounds better at some points that way. It sounds weird to a lot of people, but actually there's sometimes where I think songs are far too slow, and they do actually sound better at a quicker pace. So goofy enough on me, right? So anyways, we have Clark, and we have Martha, and we have Jonathan, and Clark is to get up for his day and is to notice both Martha and both Jonathan who are going through all of their bills and all of their things that they have to go on and pay people for, and so on and so forth. And so we have Clark, who is to do easily all the math within his head because he's really good at math. And so I guess that's not all the superpowers that Clark's have. He has in these episodes. He's really good at math too. So we have Martha and Jonathan that are to really want Clark to not pay too much attention of what all they're trying to figure out here, and instead want to go off to school, or otherwise he'll be late again. For a guy that can run like a bullet, I think that's the main reason why Clark really doesn't go on and feels a desperate need to get to school so quickly. But we also have Clark, who's to get his Pop-Tart or his toaster strudel or whatever it ends up being for this week, and then making his way to class. So we go on and have Clark, who makes it to school, and we, of course, after that have where Lex is consistently trying to talk to both Jonathan and Martha about their financials. And so Lex is to try to go on and reason with Kent's, but of course Jonathan is so stubborn. And so eventually within this episode, Lex goes on and is to try to talk to Martha, and then Martha goes on and talks to Jonathan, and then it gets both Martha and Jonathan to arrive at Lex's place to then finally have Lex try to desperately go on and strike up a deal to help out the Kents. Because weirdly, we just have it to where, like, Lex is to see that Clark has the perfect family, the perfect life, and Lex, of course, is to want to somehow, use owning the Kents in some way, to get a feel for having a happy family, of which that Lex has never had, because of course Lex briefly had a brother at some point that was to, I think, die or disappear while Lex was young, and Lex's mother was to die while she was young, and you never really hear much about Lex's mother. And Lionel, of course, to be Lionel, so like Lex is desperately wanting to have some kind of, whether it be to pay somebody off, but to be like some kind of family member. So, anyways, we'll find out a lot of this kind of stuff in other episodes. I'm kind of jumping the gun a lot, but anyways, it is what it is. So, plus even with this episode, I'm kind of jumping the gun anyways. So, we go on and we have, after school, Lana is at the Beanery just reading a book, and I kind of assume Krug, or Kirsten Krug, is to honestly be this kind of person without her actually being Lana. Like, I imagine, like, how you would see her here is probably how you would normally see Kristen, and like she's probably like playing who she really is right here. So we have Whitney who approaches Lana, and it seems that Lana is to plan this whole getaway with Whitney to go to Metropolis and just kind of do some some kind of tourist kind of thing. And we instead have Whitney, who is to go on and tell Lana that he can't, because I guess him and his friends has gone on and ordered some pay-per-view, some boxing thing, and so it seems that Whitney is not going to be available for Lana, because I guess Whitney is to forget that Lana even exists at some point, to just, like, you would think that Whitney, having Lana as a girlfriend, would have Whitney just go on and be thinking, like, hey, shouldn't I drag Lana to every single one of these things? Really meaning, because that sounded horrible, really meaning that shouldn't Whitney ask Lana to all of these things, or ask her if it's okay to do any number of these things before just going on and gallivanting and doing whatever he wants to? Because again, you should probably ask for permission, right? Before you go on and do something. Anyways, that's just me. That's, I don't know. You should probably go on and ask your girl if you have plans, and then go on like, yeah, let's go on and just drink it up or whatever. Anyways, so Whitney goes on and is to do this pay-per-view thing, and so he leaves. And so that all of a sudden has Lex coming in and is to again see that Lana like doesn't have plans for this weekend, and all she's doing is just reading a book at the Beanery, which we also are to see the very first image of the Talon being used, as the name is to be showcased within these episodes. So that's kind of cool. So anyways, we go on to, of course, have Lex, who is to see Clark. And so Lex goes on and makes a bet with Clark that since Lana is all by her lonesome, Lex is to then go on and quickly give Clark tickets to Radiohead, and kind of wondering like why exactly Radiohead. Um, but hey, like to really look at it, like South Park at one point was to reference Radiohead in their show, so maybe Radiohead is just a really popular band that a lot of times ends up getting used or referenced somewhere in shows for whatever reason. I've never really listened to Radiohead, but eventually I've heard of them because South Park reference. Anyways, so but Lex is to do this bet with Clark about these Radiohead tickets, and for Lex to give Clark these tickets to then go ask Lana out. And if he goes on and quickly asks her out, he'll also fork over some money for a limo. I'm like, holy crap, like, how expensive is all of this? Man, Lex is just, like, I guess because he couldn't go on and give Clark this truck, and Clark had to forcibly return it, now Lex has to just go on and just figure out a way to still buy Clark's affection, even though Clark easily still wants to be Lex's friend. But maybe that's just the way Lex is to do things, where he just wants to buy people's affections, which is okay at the end of the day. But again, I'm just thinking about all like the money for this, how much this probably costs to do all of that. Anyways, so we go on and we have Clark who meets up with Lana and is to ask her out on this date. And we, of course, have Lana who's to say, I don't know, like, what if Whitney is to find. And so, like, Clark is just like, well, we'll go as just friends. Like, that's all. It's not a date, it's just a friend thing. And so Lana's like, well, okay, that sounds fun. And we also had Lex who is telling Clark that since Lana is not exactly married to Whitney, that this guy is just an obstacle. Oh my god, the guy who is Flash Gordon at some point is just some obstacle. Come on! Flash Gordon reference, because technically the guy who plays Whitney goes on and does a Flash Gordon series, if I didn't say that before, or eventually have a number of episodes that I've already reviewed of Flash Gordon, because really I always go on and tend to watch a number of shows simply because of Smallville, and it's weird how that all works out. So, we go on and we have Clark who gets a yes from Lana, and so now Clark is on cloud 9. He's, of course, having his parents realize, like, hey, who's this kid, this happy-go-lucky guy? Like, who is this guy? And Clark is just like, well, yeah, I'm going out with Lana, and I'm going to go to this concert, and me and Lana are going to ride this limo. And so while Martha and Jonathan are looking on after Clark is to walk away, I'm like, well, I guess Lex strikes again as Jonathan is to walk on and just be ticked by the fact that since Lex couldn't go on and talk to Jonathan, Lex went on to talk to Martha, and then Martha went on to talk to Jonathan and convinced him, like, so. Anyways, we go on and still have Clark, who is going to school, to meet up with, of course, Chloe and Pete. And so, as they're walking into school, we notice that Sean, who has gone on and become sick at one point and gone to the nurse's office and said that he is to feel cold, and the woman putting a thermometer in the guy's mouth has realized, like, well, wait a minute, like, this guy's a popsicle. And then the nurse ends up touching this guy's forehead, and we have Sean that consumes a bit of this girl's body warmth and is to feel much better. That's when Sean starts to realize that if he consumes body heat, that he'll be able to last longer in more places than the bedroom. That was a dumb joke. Anyways, because of course the first thing that Sean does when he gets out of the lake, he tries to consume this fire, and that seems to be a temporary fix for him. But then eventually, when he goes to school the next day, he realizes he needs something more. So eventually, once Sean is to quickly start to need a fix again, as if he's weirdly an addict for body warmth, we have Sean that goes on and is to bump into Chloe again, while Pete and Clark are also there. And Sean is to ask Chloe out, and Chloe is to say, well, no, I'm sorry, I'm busy tonight. And so Sean completely just blows her off and finds a girl named Jenna, who it seems Jenna is to be interested in Sean and is to make quick work of them going on and possibly being together. Maybe not in a date capacity, but just together. So we go on to have Jenna, who is taking a shower at her home, and all of a sudden it seems that Sean is going and walking into this bathroom, and so Jenna is to say to Sean that it's like, well, hey, like, you want to come in and take a shower with me? And all of a sudden we realize that Sean is to not be the normal Sean of which that we had seen when Sean was to ask this girl out originally, that he is much more blue to the face. So Jenna is to, of course, use this shower curtain as a way to hide her body, because this is a certain kind of rated show. And so Jenna falls, and the curtain is to censor her, so to speak. And so now we, of course, have Sean, who is to need her body warmth. And so Sean is to go on and grab Jenna and start to suck the warmth out of her, and then goes on and is to kiss her to basically finish her off. And then Sean is to kind of drop this body, and the body completely shatters upon the ground, as if this is Demolition Man by the end of that film. So, or Terminator 2, for those of you who are to go on and see the spot where eventually Terminator takes down and like cryo freezes the T-1000, and then it breaks, but then it liquefies again and comes back together. Anyways, so we have Clark, who is very nervous for this technically friend's date with Lana. And we go on and we have Pete, and we have Chloe, we have everybody and the brother that is going on and saying that this is a date. But Clark is saying, no, it's not a date. It's just a get-together between friends. So we have Clark even needing to figure out what to wear for this date, because he's really taking the time to figure out what to wear, going through every cliche-ish date thing that you could possibly go on and do for this episode. because really we need to eat up some time here. So we then go on and have Clark, who goes with Lana on this date into the limo. And so we have Clark, who's going on and doing this card trick where he can see through the card and is to see that it's a three of hearts. And so Clark is to go on and talk to Chloe and go on and talk about how they can see themselves as certain like characters in a book, or like certain kind of books and stuff like that. And it's kind of interesting dialogue here, but eventually it's not interesting enough for, I guess, me to remember, because there's a lot going on in this show. So with that said, we of course have Clark, who is to notice on the news that now Sean is to be possibly a prime suspect in the death of Jenna on this news, and Clark is to know that it seems that Chloe is to go on and get a date with Sean next. Because it seems that when Clark is to talk to Chloe about her date that she is going to have, and mentioned that Clark can't be the only one who gets lucky in the dating game, and so Clark is to mention to Chloe about Jenna, and Chloe is to just go on and say it's like, well, I guess maybe that didn't work out or something like that. So anyways, we have Martha and we have Jonathan making their way to Lex's mansion. And so Lex was to tell Martha that supposedly a number of farmers are all going to make their way to Lex's mansion to talk about their finances, and Lex is going to want to go on and fund these people so he can make a business proposition out of them. And so that way he can make money also. But he is to say that he's going to be like this kind of silent partner and so on and so forth. But anyways, so when Martha and Jonathan make their way to Lex's, come to find out the only real person that's going to be here besides Lex is to be Martha and Jonathan, because no other farmer came here, and so Lex had lied about it, and Jonathan is to go on and be like, aha, like we caught Lex in another lie, like he's lying to us to just like try to make this all about us. And Lex is to admit to that, just like, well, yeah, like I would do something like that, and I did do something like that. So what? So we come to find out have Jonathan's father, who was to take out a number of loans in the past to try and go on and hope that the farm would somehow succeed. And Lex has to point that out to Jonathan to just say, like, well, hey, like, your father had to go on and swallow his pride to eventually try to keep his farm alive. So, Jonathan, like, why can't you go on and do the exact same thing? And so Lex is to kind of break down like all of the math and all of everything that is to go into all of this, and he is to do his due diligence. And so at least Martha and Jonathan are willing to hear him out. So now back to the action. We have Lana and we have Whitney. And so come to find out, Clark is to go on and leave his date with Lana to go and rescue Chloe. Clark is to go on and find out that that Chloe is to go on and leave the torch and make her way to follow this whole like flower petal uh, thing that eventually leads her to the pool. And so we have Sean that is to approach Chloe and is to be very blue in the face again. And so Chloe, of course, is to be very scared. Chloe jumps into the pool, is to try to swim to the other side of the pool. We have Sean that uses his powers to freeze the pool, and Chloe ends up getting stuck. Clark makes his way to the pool, is to bash through the ice of this pool to rescue Chloe's leg, and has Chloe limp out of there, as then Clark is to stand by Chloe until Sean, of course, is to possibly decide to leave and go elsewhere, which eventually Sean goes and is to find both Lana and both Whitney on the side of the road after this almost accident that Whitney swerves out of the way from. And so, come to find out, Lana is at the beanery again, and Pete is talking to Lana about, like, well, hey, like, what happened to you and Clark? And Lana's like, yeah, about that, like, it just didn't work out. Clark was worried about Chloe, and so, like, he left our date. And so Pete is going and telling Lana, it's like, well, hey, like, out of all the times that, like, Clark is to really like you, it doesn't make sense for him to go on and, like, leave to go on and be somewhere else. So, kind of saying that, like, Clark really likes Lana, and Pete is to let that kind of slip here. So, anyways, we have Whitney, who is to also be at the beanery, and is to find out about the whole date that wasn't really a date, because Lana ends up telling Whitney the truth. So, because Whitney is to at some point say that he wants to let it go, but he wanted to just ask anyways. So, Whitney and Lana are driving to eventually almost run over Sean. And then so when these guys swerve out of the way, we have Sean who wants to go on and grab either Lana or Whitney to drain them. And instead, Clark comes to the rescue, and Sean ends up draining Clark instead, having, of course, Clark become this popsicle. And so Whitney and Lana run off to eventually make their way to Lex's mansion. And so supposedly Lana's ankle, or Lana's, yeah, I think Lana's ankle is messed up here, whatever that means. And so we now have Sean, who is to make it to Lex's mansion. So we have, of course, Sean, who is to drain Lex's generator, because we also have Sean find out that he can kind of drain electricity and start to feel this warmth, but it doesn't work all that well. So eventually, like, his powers start to drain quicker. So, because while, like, Sean is trying to find his next date, he is to light these matches and call these women, and eventually gets this, like, brief warmth, but doesn't quite work out. So Sean goes on to eventually try and wait for somebody to fix things within the mansion and drain them. And so it seems we not only in these episodes go on and have like Martha and Jonathan who are doing certain farming jobs, which I think is kind of funny. Like we had Lex, who is to notice Martha is trying to do some farming job, and Lex is to go on and tell Martha, like, hey, I come in peace. And not only that, but then we have Martha and we have Jonathan who are going on and trying to fix certain things. Like, I think Martha was to go on and try to fix this generator. And so Sean eventually is to come up from behind her, and that's when Clark ends up coming to the mansion and fighting off Sean again. Where, of course, we have Sean, who is to have a number of different kind of hot and cold kind of jokes, where he's to go on and say stuff like "brr," or he's to go on and be like, "Man, your mom, she's hot." So like we have these like temperature jokes, and I'm like, okay, whatever. I'm like, whatever kind of gets you, keeps you warm at night, so to speak. So we have Sean who is to face off with Clark, and what ends up happening is that Sean likes to continue to grab onto Clark because every time he grabs onto him, he realizes that he is to feel so much better draining Clark compared to so many other people. And it seems that he has an endless supply because Clark always eventually doesn't get killed off like everyone else does. So what happens is when Sean is to desperately try to fight Clark and need warmth, we have Clark who chucks Sean into this lake that isn't frozen. And because I guess we just have just drastically different lakes here. Some are colder than others. I don't know. It is what it is. So Sean ends up being tossed into this lake, and the lake ends up freezing around him, and that neutralizes Sean for this episode. So we then go on and have within the next day that Jonathan is to go on and take a loan out with this bank, and Lex is to hear about it and is to confront Jonathan about it. Like, well, hey, like, you went on and took out a loan from this bank? Like, how could you? Like, you know they're gonna kill you with interest rates, and like eventually they're gonna bury your farm and this and that. I'm like, this feels like Yellowstone. Like I'm watching Yellowstone all over again. And kind of the funny thing is we have Kevin Costner, who of course was in a Superman movie at some point, Man of Steel. So, and technically other superhero films at some point. But anyways, so considering whichever one that you watch. Anyways, so we go on into this episode and have Jonathan say, like, well, I went on and took a loan out with this bank because at least with the banks, I know where I stand. And with you, not quite sure. So that's kind of interesting because, like, eventually, like, I think Lex does go on and help out the Kents and does buy them out. But eventually, within a number of movies, eventually we have Bruce Wayne who buys out, like, the farm and everything like that because Justice League. Anyways, we we also have Clark, who by the end of this episode is to ask Lana about why she goes on and why she dates Whitney. And Lana makes the statement that when Lana needs Whitney, he's there. And the one time that Lana was to be with Clark, he wasn't. He vanished. Because there's something mysterious about him, like Pete was to go on and say when he was talking to Lana. So, really, that's got to be heartbreaking that because Clark wanting to go on and do the right thing and save people will cost him Lana in the end because Clark will never be there when eventually Clark is to be with Lana. And that's why, for a number of episodes, when they actually have they will, they won't, they kind of thing, eventually Lana just gets tired of the lies of Clark and wants to know the truth. And then we get a number of seasons later where Lana does eventually get closer than she was before about getting to know who Clark really is. Let's try to leave it vague. So, with that said, now we have to go on and get to. Now we have to go on and get to episode 6, which I didn't like this episode, obviously. So, in the beginning of episode 6, we go on and we have both Pete and we have both Clark. We're going on to this old folks home, which I don't know the actual name of. And so both of them are trying to do their community service for high school. Luckily for me, when I was in high school, I was to eventually go on and do my community service by volunteering for a haunted house that I did for a number of days. Because, like, in my senior year, I enrolled in certain acting classes for high school, so I don't know what that really means. And so eventually I went on and I was to do like certain like usher like things for certain plays when I eventually wasn't to be casted in any number of those plays. Or eventually I went on and did a haunted house, and that kind of took most of my community service. I'm like, thank God, because I'm like, I don't know how I could go on and do community service for high school. And plus also I'm like you can't go on and easily get community service done. I don't know how anybody like gets it done every year, and I don't even know why they even have community service that you have to do so we can graduate. It doesn't make any sense to me, but it is what it is. Whatever. Unless you do it out of the goodness of your heart anyways, and eventually that would help you out in a high school thing. It is what it is. Anyways, pushing on. So, Clark and... oh my god, this is an hour already. Oh my god, I'm going to try to quickly get through this freaking episode. So, Clark and Pete are to go on to eventually go and do community service. And so Pete is mentioning that they should have really gone on and been lifeguards at some pool instead of watching over old people. And so Clark is to go on and say, no, like, this is going to be a fun job. And plus also, Lana is to be working there, hence why Clark did this, just to get closer to Lana. Because that's all he does. He just wants to get close to that Lana. What point is that going to be, really? Because again, Lana has Whitney. If Lana and Whitney broke up, then eventually for Clark, there might be a chance. But yeah, Clark is just pining away for something that is never going to happen, and he might as well just really keep thinking of that, because I know that to be true. Anyways, so Cassandra is to be the woman, of course, that Clark is going to see to assist. And so Clark is to go on and eventually after talking to Lana and talking about Cassandra, we have Clark making his way to meet up with Cassandra, who is to be this fortune teller. And so Cassandra ends up touching Pete and mentioning to him that it's going to be a long walk home for Pete because he is to go on and check his pockets. Pete is to realize that, of course, he does not have his keys because he locked his keys in his car. And I guess since he doesn't have a cell phone to call for a locksmith or know anybody with extra keys, yeah, I guess he's walking. So we have Clark that meets up with Cassandra and ends up touching her hand. And we, of course, have Cassandra who's telling Clark that someone very close to him will die in this episode. And that never really comes to pass. That never really happens. Because, of course, Clark is to be this superhero that can easily go on and save everybody. So Clark is worried for nothing because he just needs something to do in this episode because they need some filler of time to add certain people that, of course, Clark is to know and just be worried about all of them, so that way they can justifiably have some lines within this episode. It's also kind of like the episode where in Supernatural, Jensen Ackles is to be afraid of everything to the point of him even being afraid of a really small dog, and he runs away from it at some point because that's freaking hilarious. But anyways, if you've never gone on and seen Supernatural in your life, go ahead and check out the one episode where Jensen Ackles is afraid of everything. And if you don't come off enjoying that show and watching every single episode after that, to the very pilot, to the very end, then I don't blame you, because eventually I was only interested past episode or season 8, and then I lost interest. But very funny, like early seasons, and I liked them. Anyways, pushing on. So, and eventually you'll see Jensen Ackles on the show. Anyways, Smallville. Moving on. So, see how bored I am? I want to talk about anything else but this episode. Anyways, moving on. So, we also have Lana who is taking care of a guy named Harry that has 2 different names in this same episode. So, we have Lana who's taking care of a guy named Harry, and what ends up happening is that Harry is to want to sneak away some cigarette, and when he drops his lighter, he ends up trying to retrieve his lighter while he's in this wheelchair, and he ends up falling over into this pond, which is to have like back-to-back episodes where oddly we have to have people falling into water to give them superpowers, weirdly. And so in this one, all of a sudden we have the Fountain of Youth superpower where Harry is to turn into a younger version of himself and is now wearing these scrubs, and no one's to ask him his ID. This guy can just walk, and no one asks a single question. So we have Harry that goes to the beanery and is to ask for all kinds of food that he hasn't gone on and eaten in years, like a burger or drinks coffee. And so Harry is to go on and meet up with Clark, Lana, and Chloe, because of course all 3 of them are asking what had happened to Harry because he just disappeared. So we go on and have Harry, who is to start to talk similar to the older Harry, and Lana starts to pick up on it, but she's like, I don't know. So they're going on and also realizing that the younger picture of Harry is all of a sudden missing. And we also are to go on, and I think at some point have Chloe and Pete show the photo through a newspaper of a younger Harry. And Clark is to mention, oh my god, like I've seen this guy before. I've seen him at the Beanery. And so immediately the consensus of what Pete and Chloe make up is just like, well, maybe this is some grandson of his, or maybe it's some family member that just looks just like him. So we go on and have, of course, Lex, who is to drive like a wild man, and since Clark is to now know that someone close to him may die, Clark is to try to tell Lex, like, hey, don't drive so crazy. And the funny thing of it is we had Michael Rosenbaum, who was to go on and mention that eventually when a lot of these kind of vehicles and stuff were loaned out to them, how Michael Rosenbaum admitted that there was some times where he would just kind of wildly drive cars and do whatever he wanted, because really when looking at it, it's like, well, like this show can just write this all off, and whatever happens to this car, it's just a write-off for them. And so eventually, like, to just like relieve stress of doing something fun on the show, so whoops so anyways, we then have Clark, who's just kind of checking up on all of his family members and all of his friends. We have Clark, who goes on and sees Martha and Jonathan are doing some cutting with certain things to use for the farm, and Clark is going like, "Hey guys, like, why are you doing any of this? It's all dangerous." And Jonathan's like, "Well, like we got to keep the farm running," kind of thing. It's like, I don't get why you're so jumpy right now. So Clark is to have to admit to his family that he was to go on and get this fortune being told by Cassandra, that one of the people closest to him will die. We also have Lex, who is to hear that from Clark, and so Lex is to go on and check out this fortune teller girl himself, because Lex in this episode is to go on and show Clark the Porsche, and is to, of course, have Clark and him try to still figure out how Lex is not dead, how like certain parts of this car should not be the way they had been, and really because Clark had used his super strength to open up this car more to get Lex out of the car, but Clark will never say that to Lex. So, anyways, we have Clark again, who meets up with Cassandra. And eventually, when Clark is to touch Cassandra this time around, he is to see all the graves and all the names that are on it. And he realizes that, like, so many people close to him will eventually die, which most of the tombstones that are around him actually do not make sense. But it's just something to make Clark just leery that he really has to go on and make sure he saves everybody, or someone close to him will eventually die, but it won't be so early on in the show. and it won't be so many frequent people that die all at the same time. That wouldn't make sense now, would it? So, so we go on into this show. So we have Harry that goes on to the Beanery, and since Harry is to go on and know everybody in this town and is to know like the ancestor of every one of these characters, we go on and have Harry, I think at first, who goes on and attacks this guy called Jim Gage and is to come to his house as a guy that is to fix people's gas. And so, or fix people's electricity, like it's some kind of common thing like that. So Harry goes to Jim Gage's place and is to ask him, of course, about his father. And so the guy goes on and says, yeah, like my dad was this guy, what have you. So Harry goes on and is to have this wire and is to choke Jim Gage out and kills him. And so now after this death was to go on and happen, we had, of course, Lana, who is to give the backstory of Harry after Lana is to show that Harry's younger photo is gone. And so, come to find out, Lana is to reveal to Clark that Harry used to be a former murderer who had spent his time in prison and gotten released to end up in this old folks' home. And so, this guy who had murdered and been convicted was to eventually kill his teacher and go on and then spend his time in prison and then get out. So now Harry is to seek revenge on all the ancestors of all these family members and who had been the jury of this trial. And so now we have Harry going after Jim, and eventually through a newspaper, Harry is to realize all the juror names and is to realize that Zoe may be next. Connecting all these names together, and eventually he also, Clark is to realize that his father is on the chopping block also. Because Harry, and so Clark eventually is to talk to Harry at some point when Harry loses his youth and becomes old again, and Harry is to go on and mention to Clark that, oh yeah, you're adopted, so the last descendant of the Kent name really is actually Jonathan Kent from his grandfather. And so instead of Harry going after Clark, he goes after Jonathan instead, who Jonathan's father is to have also gone on and been this jury that convicted Harry of this crime of murder. So, anyways, we go on and have Zoe, who is to be this waitress at the Beanery. And so if Harry doesn't go on and is to play the piano right by Cassandra, and Cassandra wants Harry's help to get out of this chair, and Harry realizes that Cassandra is just trying to go on and see what this guy's future is of possibly killing people, and so Harry walks away. We also had Lex, that, of course, was also not wanting to get his hand read by this woman either, because he can make his own destiny. He can make his own future. But eventually, by the end of the episode, Lex changes his mind because he might think that a number of things may be at risk for his future. So we go on to have now Harry, who's going after Zoe, and we have Clark, who is trying to prevent Zoe's death. And so Zoe runs away for Clark to now face off with Harry. And eventually, when Clark is to knock Harry out, the next thing that we end up seeing is a much older Harry at the hospital. And so, since they were looking for a young guy and now find the older version of Harry, they make up some story that I guess the younger Harry was to go on and cuff this older man and put him in his place. But we have Clark that makes the more accurate assumption that the younger Harry and this Harry are one and the same guy. So Clark is to be watching over this older Harry, and he doesn't watch him well enough because Harry goes on to eventually regain his youth again by jumping into this pond and becoming young again. So Harry goes on to go to the Kent farm to talk to Martha about their gas, and is to eventually ask for Jonathan. And so Martha's go on and say, well, normally we have a guy named Kurt who comes in here, and so I guess instead we're just going to have you today? And Harry's like, well, I guess so. So Martha is to go on and try to call the police because there's not a guy named Kurt there. She just makes this name up. So Harry goes on and tells Martha there's not a real guy named Kurt with the gas company, is there? And Martha's like, nope. So Harry goes on and chases after Martha, which eventually leads both the two of them to go on into a part of this farm that starts dumping out all of this feed, and eventually that starts to have Martha and Harry be buried by this. Let me pause here for a second. Alright, so eventually Martha and both Harry are in this location getting buried by this feed. Clark goes on to figure out, as he had read this newspaper, that Jonathan is to be the next target. So we go on and we have Clark, who is to find out if Jonathan is okay, which of course he is. So then instead, Clark goes on to use his X-ray vision to see if it's possible that his mother may be in danger also. So Clark goes on and uses his X-ray vision to go on and find Martha is buried. So Clark goes on and is to open up this part of this this area to then go on and free Martha and have, of course, Jonathan going on and doing CPR on Martha to revive her. And then Martha is to go on and tell Clark that everyone that's close to Clark is going to be fine. See? That eventually, like, Clark will just save everybody and everyone will be fine. So we then have an older version of Harry that is to now be having his hand out, telling us that finally this whole case is resolved. So by the end of this episode, what we're really left here is that Lex is to go on and meet with Cassandra after all, and is to, of course, go on and want to get his fortune read, or fortune told to him. So, Lex is to ask Cassandra about Clark and wanting to know everything about Clark, and Cassandra tells Lex that it doesn't work that way. That when she touches somebody, she can only see their path and their path alone. She can't see anyone else's future. It doesn't work that way. So, when Cassandra does touch the hand of Lex, Cassandra then realizes that Lex is to become the president of the United States, or wherever country that you are to have a president in. And then Lex goes on to eventually, by touching things, kills everything. Simply by touching it. So, realizing that Cassandra is to realize, like, the work of the worst possible villain in his future, Cassandra, I'm assuming, has some kind of heart attack and dies right then and there. Lex, of course, to be so mortified by the fact that Cassandra is technically dead, and so he ends up having a nurse come in there, and the nurse ends up going on and putting the girl's eyes closed. Clark goes in there, and we, of course, have this nurse that tells Clark, I'm sorry, she's passed. So, Clark, by the end of the episode, is to mention that Cassandra had to have seen her future, and that's why she died. So, she must have seen that she was to die, so she did. Oddly enough. So, that's how episode 6 is to go on and end here. Really, in a very roundabout way, I don't really go on into much of the actual investigation work that Chloe and Pete and Clark go into. But with that said, I also just kind of quickly kind of go over certain parts of this episode to just kind of get them out of the way and done, because there's just some certain scenes that I don't really care about, or there's just certain bits of dialogue that I want to just try to dance around. So that said, I think I should go on and get out of here to try to make this as short as possible, but it is what it is with the length of these things. So goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.